Hello. In this video we're going to talk about sewing the lined silky top. Okay, so we're going to be starting with our two self pieces front and back and our two lining pieces front and back. Now I just use the same fabric for both front and back so that they will be the same. In this case it's a better idea. Okay, so I just want to show you the pattern real quick. Okay, so here's the pattern for the back lining, and here's the pattern for the back top. And I just want you to see that the pattern has been adjusted. You can see the difference there, that when I created the pattern I shaved off about a 1/16 of an inch on both sides of the shoulder, and that's so that when you sew the lining on and you understitch, it'll make the lining smaller so that the seam won't stick out. If we had left it all the way to the edge, then we'd have a problem after understitching that the lining will have like a little bit of extra fabric. So this adjusts for what we call the turn of the cloth, and also because of the understitching. Okay, so I just wanted to show you that. I did the same thing on the facings as well, just so that the facings don't show after they're sewn. Okay, so we're going to start with right sides together. Now I just want to show you a little trick of what I did on mine so that I would know which one was the lining. Because the lining is cut smaller, we want to somehow indicate which one's the lining so that, you know, if you're using the same fabric, how do you know which one is which? The only way you might be able to tell is look at the width of the shoulders because the lining is narrower. So what I did is, as I took the pattern off, I just made a small little X on both of my lining pieces so that I would know which one was the lining. Okay, that helps me later when I want to do the things like the understitching. Which direction, do I turn the seam towards? Which side of the seam allowance do I trim? I just look for the X to tell me, okay, that's the lining, so I'll trim the seam allowance closest to the lining shorter. I'll turn the seam allowance towards the lining and do my understitching and that sort of thing. Okay, all right, so when I first started doing this, before I really got going sewing, what I did is a stay stitching around all the different edges. Okay, so that's quite a number of pieces. You're going to have your back neck of your lining, your front neck of your top, and then you have the front lining neck, and then you have your front top neck, and then you have all of the armholes too. So you've got 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 10 11 12 rows of stay stitching that you need to do before you get started. But it's really a good idea because you don't want the edges stretching out of shape. You can see I've already sewn this neckline and look how it's laying very beautifully. If I didn't baste it first or stay stitch it first, it could stretch out of shape and then it would be unsightly. Okay, now I'm just going to do a row of stay stitching here so you can see it, because I think it's good for you to see me do it. I'm setting my machine on a little bit longer stitch. I'm going to use a stitch length of 3. My normal stitch for this weight of fabric would be a 2, because it's a lighter weight fabric. So the lighter the weight of fabric, the smaller the stitch that you use. But because I'm basting, I'm going to use a longer stitch so they can be easily removed. Okay, so I'm looking, I have one edge that needs still to be basted, and I'm going to do that. Okay, so it's not that one. Let's see. Okay, here it is. So I left one armhole with it not stay stitched because I wanted to show you how I was going to do it. Okay, so I set my machine stitch on a 3, and I don't really need to back stitch on this, but I do want to set the needle. And the other thing is you can sometimes get some puckering on this because the fabric's so lightweight. So hold it firmly, don't stretch it, but hold it firmly. Do you see how I'm holding it front and back as I do the stay stitching? That's so it won't pucker up. Okay, now if it does pucker up, we can just clip the seam allowance every once in a while to release some of the tension. Okay, and I did have to do that on a couple of my edges because they just sometimes they pucker up a little bit. Okay, all right, so I'm finishing up my stay stitching. So I've done all of those 12 edges. Okay, all right. Just wanted you to see that. I'm going to go back to regular length stitch, and we're going to stitch in a little bit, but I wanted you to see what I've done so far. Okay, I'm going to just trim this thread because we don't need all that extra. Okay, I like to try to keep it clean as I'm working. Okay, so I put my back pieces together, the lining and the self, and I matched the edge. I sewed it, I graded it so the lining side is trimmed shorter. I clipped the seam allowance, I pressed it towards the lining, and then I understitched it. Okay, so those steps are outlined here with right sides together, align top front with top lining, and stitch a 1/4 inch seam along the neck, clip the seam allowance and press towards lining, understitch along neck edge, and repeat the same procedure for the back. Okay, so that's pretty easy. Now if your stay stitching shows at all, I would remove it now, but go ahead and we get that sewn, we understitch it, and then I turn it to the right side and get a really nice press on the outside like you can see I've done here. Okay, so it looks really beautiful. Here's my front. You can tell the front because it's a little deeper, and you can see that neckline looks really good. It's not stretched out of shape, and it's, you know, it's been understitched, and so it looks really nice. Okay, so I'm going to show you a different method of sewing this top together compared to what we did on the facing sample, and it requires that we go ahead now and do the armhole of the front. Now I'm just going to tell you that the reason I didn't go ahead with the armhole is because I want to get this neckline seam sewn, graded, clipped, understitched, and pressed real well. Okay, if I had sewn both of them at the same time, I wouldn't be able to understitch the front neck all the way to the edge because this would be too narrow to get in there and understitch. So do a complete job on the neck, including the understitching, then we can go ahead with the armhole. Okay, now the back, we're not going to sew the armhole. We're going to do that later, and that'll be in our next video. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to place this right sides together. I'm going to match the edge, the cut edge, and then of course the ends here at the side seam and at the shoulder. Now do you see how sometimes you end up with one seam's a little bigger than the other? Let me show you what to do to adjust that. I am going to go ahead and put a pin here to hold the end. Remember when I was talking to you about stay stitching a few minutes ago, I said sometimes you have to release some of the tension. Okay, so this is how you release the tension. Just every once in a while, clip your stay stitching on the one that's smaller. Okay, so this one is the side that's a little bit smaller. Just, you know, maybe I didn't hold it you know, under tension at all. Okay, so I'm just going to clip every once in a while. Probably don't need to do it too much right here. It looks like it's, well, I'll do one more. Okay, and then on the other side, just do some random cuts too. They don't have to be in the exact same spot, but when you do that, you can relieve some of the tension caused by the stay stitching. Okay, just enough to shrink it back or to let it stretch out enough to fit the other piece. Okay, so let me just finish up the clips. It's funny, we put the stay stitching in to get some control, and then we go back and we clip it. But you know what? You do what you have to do to make things turn out perfectly. We wouldn't want to try to stitch it together with one being smaller and one larger, because then we'd have puckering, wouldn't we? Okay, so just that clipping should have made them so they're almost the same length now. Okay, so I'm going to pin here on the end. Okay, and yeah, see that? They're a lot closer, aren't they? I can just take it and just pull it a little bit to relieve some of those stitches. Okay, that's probably going to be enough, and they should match pretty well now. So I'm going to go ahead and bring them together. And if one side seems like it's still a little larger, put that side against the feed of the machine and it will feed it through faster and it will come out even. Okay, so there's some little tricks that you can do when you have one side that's just slightly longer. But this really, it should be okay now that I released some of that, the stitches on the other side. Okay, so we're going to sew this armhole with a stitch length of 2. So a shorter stitch length because of the fabric. Then I'm going to grade it, trimming the lining seam allowance down to 1/8. How do I know which one's the lining? I look for my X. Okay, so there's my X. So this side of the seam allowance will be shorter. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and sew my 1/2 inch seam on this. Now I'm going to grade it, I'm going to press it, but I'm not going to be able to understitch all the way to the shoulder, and that's okay. Sometimes you just can't get into where you might want to, and so I won't be doing that. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stitch my my 1/4 inch seam here along the armhole. I'm going to go ahead and grade it. I'm going to go ahead and clip it, and I'm going to go ahead and understitch it as far as I can go. In the next video, I'm going to show you how to join the shoulders of the front and back.